Hello, I am Sinner, and today I'm coming at you with something rather new. I found this interesting article which I want to share, and it's about American politics. You see, in America, um, everyone is of the opinion that it's a democracy, right? But when you read people who aren't like democratic, maybe like socialists or aristocratic leaning people or monarchists or whatever, they always label the United States, as well as other Western democracies, as plutocracies. And a plutocracy is a country where the rich run everything, not the people. That would be a democracy. And I came across this article called Testing Theories of American Politics: Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens by Martin Gilens and Benjamin I. Page. And I want to share this with you guys today because I think it's very illuminating. So, first thing we're going to do is just go through what the goal of this article is. And the goal of the article, of the study, is to ask which school of thought best predicts policy in the United States of America. There are four systems researchers use to look at and predict policy action in the USA, and what they represent is a sort of guess of which organization of people affect policy, or like how the policy is influenced, I guess you could say. And in another way, who has the power to affect policy? Is it the people or who? And this is the crux of the study. And it's a very important question to ask, because if you can predict who has the power to affect policy, what you're really asking is it a democracy or not? And the school of thoughts are as follows. First is majoritarian electoral democracy. This is the school of thought that argues that the main cause of policy enactment or policy change, or lack of policy change, is by the will of the majority of people who vote and their own personal interests, right? This is the classic of the people, by the people, for the people. And it's also the mainstream narrative that everyone's taught in schools. That's what I was taught about democracy. And um, it's also what I've been taught, what it means to live under a democracy, right? And this theory argues that basically the median voter, or whatever policy views the majority will have, will in fact be represented by the government and thus enacted as such. This is why, for example, in a two-party system, the policies and views of the parties are more similar than different, as both the parties must compete to win the middle of the bell curve, so to speak. And this view doesn't account for special interests, economic elites, or interest groups. Next is economic elite domination. So, this school of thought, also known as elite theory, argues that the majority of influence over policy comes from the quote unquote elite. Traditionally, this is seen as like economic elite, so like those who are extremely wealthy and have massive economic resources. Think of like Trump or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. And although the theory is not exclusively economic, um, it is most of the time. But there are examples where, some will argue, for example, that the elites are a collection of people, not just with outstanding economic power, as the name suggests, but also with outstanding political power, managerial power, judicial power, and legislative power. So, like, your Supreme Court justices and, politicians and all these sorts of people also are involved in the elite. And the reason people will make this claim is because a lot of these people have shared interests, histories, um, and they're in the same circles. They have similar connections. They went to the same universities, these sorts of things. And people will also say that the elite use things like foundations, think tanks, public relation organizations, and lobbies to influence public policy, either to the extent of simply protecting elite interests or shaping all policies, right? And I'll also note something important, which is that the study couldn't find the views of the elites themselves. So it uses the views of people with extremely high incomes as a sort of stand in for the elites. Because the study presumes that the goals of extremely high income earners is more or less the same as the elite, or it assumes that there's like overlap. And then what's next is the following two systems of pluralism, which is basically this idea that interest groups are what actually affect public policy. So the first one I'll talk about is majoritarian pluralism. Now, majoritarian pluralism is this idea that all the interest groups that exist um, actually are the main thing that influences the government and policy, but because they are there's so many of them, right? They more or less accurately represent the public. So it's sort of like a democracy by proxy, if you will. So maybe you're a part of a business um, or industry, like maybe you're a farmer. So you're not being represented, but you're part of the farmers union, and the farmers union is represented or has influence over policy. Or maybe you're a firearm owner, but you don't represent yourself, but because you're part of the American, I don't know what it's called, like the National Rifle Association or something like this, because you're a part of that, you're represented in the government. So it's sort of like a democratic representation by proxy using interest groups. And one interesting thing to note is that Madison believed in this type of James Madison believed in this type of democracy. He thought this is how it worked. And I want to share a quote from the paper about this. Quote, James Madison argued that struggles among the diverse factions that would be found in an extensive republic would lead to policies more or less representative of the needs and interests of the citizenry as a whole, or at least would tend to defeat quote unquote tyrannical policies, including the much feared issuance of inflationary paper money that might cater to local majority factions of farmer debtors, but would be costly to merchant creditors. Unquote. And man, I'm so glad that that didn't happen. I'm so glad that the gold standard's still a thing and no one's using fiat quote unquote paper money these days. I'm so glad that hasn't transpired. Yeah, I just think that's funny. Anyway, on to biased pluralism. Biased pluralism is like majoritarian pluralism, except the main difference is that a few select interest groups have an outstanding impact compared to all interest groups in regards to policy. These are typically said to be like corporations, businesses, and professional associations. In this school of thought, companies would use money to fund particular political parties in order to guarantee policies that are friendly to the quote unquote investors. And the key takeaway here is that the interest groups that have money, like financial institutions, are the ones that have an outstanding impact on policy. So if you're some, random interest group that doesn't have any money, you're not really going to affect the policy as much as someone who does, right? And this theory is promoted by according to the paper, Marxists and neo-Marxists, except they kind of refer to this like quote unquote like class of financially empowered interest groups as like the bourgeoisie. And on a personal note, I kind of feel like a Marxist would not have a problem calling the economic elite bourgeoisie as well. But yeah, that's just my opinion. According to the paper, these financial interest groups purportedly use lobbying, campaign funding, and lucrative job offers after serving in the government as tactics to influence public policy in their favor. Now that the paper has established the 4 theories on how American policy can be influenced, the paper goes on to analyze the impact of policy depending on the attitudes of these different theories, right? Like from the perspective of these different theories. And the results will hopefully tell us which theory is like correct. For example, if the majoritarian electoral democracy theory is correct, then we would expect to see a positive correlation or a strong relationship between the views that the general public have for a policy and the likelihood that that policy in particular will be passed into law or not be passed into law. And conversely, you would see the economic elite not really being a factor. I won't bore you with the methodology. I'll just note that 1,779 policy cases were analyzed from the perspective of these 4 theories to see the impact on policy and to create predictive models on policy outcome. So let's just jump into the findings. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is Table 2. Now, Table 2 shows the correlations among the different policy groups. So you can see that, for example, the average citizen's preferences correlate pretty well with the preferences of the economic elite. And likewise, you see a high correlation between business interest groups and all interest groups. This study does find, however, that interest groups and the majority of the citizenry don't align on public policy. Like there's not a strong correlation there. If you look, there's only a correlation of 0.47, which isn't very high. So that sort of calls into question the theory of majoritarian pluralism that Madison believed in and other people believed in. And yeah, it's important to note that politics isn't always a zero-sum game. Often you will find that a policy that might benefit the rich will also benefit everyone else. Like, let's say hypothetically, getting rid of crime. Crime typically will benefit no one. So if everyone agrees on getting rid of crime, then it's not a surprise, right? I will say this though, the study doesn't note whether or not the views that people or the preferences that people have are actually objectively in their self-interest. You can't really measure that accurately. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because typically it's the rich and powerful who have the largest amount of influence over things like mainstream media, right? Legacy media. So when you see, the newspaper that is owned by Rupert Murdoch promoting Rupert Murdoch's ideology, it's not really surprising that a lot of people would then have the same ideology as Rupert Murdoch, right? So, if you look at things from that perspective, you also have to call into question how many views that people hold are actually objectively in their self-interest, whereas how many views were they like tricked into believing is in their self-interest when it actually isn't. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind because I would feel like the majority of people have views that aren't in their self-interest, at least some views that aren't in their self-interest. And if anyone's watched a documentary about like Edward Bernays or like PR people, you would know it's not really difficult to trick large groups of people into behaving irrationally. So that's just a little side note. Okay, now on to table 3, policy outcomes and the policy preferences of average citizens, economic elites, and interest groups. So on this table, you can see that there's models 1 to 3. And this figure that each one has basically shows the percentage of policy outcomes measured against policy preferences within a 4-year period. So if it would be a 0 if the policy outcome didn't happen within a 4-year period, and it'd be a 1 if it did. And you can see that and it's a percentage, but you can see with models 1, 2, and 3, which are bivariate, meaning that only the one group is looked at, there's a positive correlation, right? There's a positive percentage. Most of the time, each group, each model is accurately predicting, there's positive relationship there. And that's probably why there are multiple views that people have about what causes policy outcome. But as we saw in table 2, sometimes there's a positive relationship or a correlation between, for example, the economic elite's preferences and the average citizen's preferences. So if that's the case, then you need to have a model that can compare all of them against each other. And that's where Model 4 comes in. Model 4 is a multivariate analysis that shows policy outcomes in relation to the groups, and it shows a very, very different perspective. And I'm going to quote from the paper here. The estimated impact of average citizens' preferences drops precipitously to a non-significant near zero level. The paper also goes on to say, quote, the chief predictions of pure theories of majoritarian electoral democracy can be decisively rejected. Not only do ordinary citizens not have uniquely substantial power over policy decisions, they have little or no independent influence on policy at all. Now, if you want to make a case for a plutocracy and you're seeing that the economic elites do have a positive relationship between preference, and the paper itself says that there's little or no independent influence on policy at all from the average citizen, I think you would be fair enough in making that claim. That could be sufficient evidence, in my opinion. But for the sake of being thorough, we should cover the rest of the paper. And that's where we move on to Figure 1. Figure 1 shows the predicted probability of policy adoption by policy disposition. And that's shown with the left axis and the dark line. And then the gray columns and the right vertical axis is just showing basically how common each scenario was, right? But the crazy thing is when you look at the probability of policy adoption by preference, you can see here in Figure 1 that the average citizen, the probability of them getting what they wanted sits at around a 30%, right? So if 100% of average American citizens want a policy to go through, 30% chance. If literally no one wants it, it's the least popular policy ever made, still around 30%, which is to me is shocking, right? Very shocking. However, that isn't the case for the economic elites. As we can see here, when the economic elites don't want a policy to go through, it's not popular. It's basically guaranteed that it won't go through. It's almost 0%. And then if all of the economic elites approve of a policy, there's about a 60% chance that that policy goes through, which is pretty substantial. And it's a similar thing with the interest groups. However, the line is less linear for the interest groups. It's more of like a sort of logistic regression type line. Now, one of the things that the paper says about this, which is probably worth pointing out, and I'll quote the paper here, is that the US political system has a status quo bias because of the way it's set up. And let me quote the paper here because I won't be able to say it as well as the paper will. A final point. Even in a bivariate descriptive sense, our evidence indicates that the responsiveness of the US political system when the general public wants government action is severely limited. Because of the impediments to majority rule that were deliberately built into the US political system, federalism, separation of powers, bicameralism, together with further impediments due to anti-majoritarian congressional rules and procedures, the system has a substantial status quo bias. And personally, I think this is why you probably won't see like a one-to-one correlation with the economic elites and the interest groups, where with the interest groups and the economic elites, if it was one-to-one, it would have to be in a government system that's less status quo, less pro-status quo. But we can see that if the economic elites don't want something, it doesn't happen. If the economic elites do not want something, it doesn't happen. But you cannot say the same thing for the average citizens. And I think that as well is pretty damning evidence. Now let's move on to table 4. So this is table 4, the separate policy impact of business-orientated and mass-based interest groups. The point of this one really is to show the difference between mass-based interest groups and business interest groups. It's sort of like the table 2 I showed you, except it's only model 4 and it makes that distinction. And it just shows, that business interest groups have a bigger impact than mass-based interest groups. That's about it, really. I just wanted to show you guys this for the sake of being thorough. There's not really much to say on this one. That concludes all the data I wanted to show you from Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens by Martin Gilens and Benjamin I. Page. And I want to give you guys 2 quotes. Let the paper speak for itself. Quote, "The failure of theories of majoritarian electoral democracy is all the more striking because it goes against the likely effects of the limitations of our data. The preferences of ordinary citizens were measured more directly than our other independent variables, yet they are estimated to have the least effect." And the second quote is this: "Despite the seemingly strong empirical support in previous studies for theories of majoritarian democracy, our analyses suggest that majorities of the American public actually have little influence over the policies our government adopts. Americans do enjoy many features central to democratic governance, such as regular elections, freedom of speech and association, and a widespread, if still contested, franchise. But we believe that if policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans, then America's claim to being a democratic society are seriously threatened. End quote. And I think those two final quotes really sum up the paper in a great way. And I'm going to put those two, that table, table 3 and figure 1 back on the screen here, because I think these are the two damning pieces of evidence to show that it's really hard to say that America's a democracy and not a plutocracy if you believe this study to be true. The reality is statistically, according to this study, the average person, the masses, don't have sway. They don't have effects over the American electoral system. It's mostly the rich and mostly economic interest groups, and to a lesser extent, majoritarian interest groups, which to me is frustrating because it means, statistically speaking, if you're an American, you would actually have a higher impact on the policies that are passed in your government by not voting and joining and funding lobby groups, interest groups, and associations. That is actually the way to affect policy in your country. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same where I live in Australia. I'm sure that there's a study out there, and if any of you find that study, please comment it in the description. I would love to read it. But yeah, I think that this study is pretty convincing evidence that the United States of America is not a democracy, it's a plutocracy. And if this is true of America, who's to say that it isn't the case in other countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, wherever? There is, I think, a very good chance that it's the case in these countries the same way it is in the US. That's all I really have to say. Thank you for listening. I will say one more thing. I lied. This guy wrote a book on this subject, and it's called Affluence and Influence: Economic Inequality and Political Power in America. That's a book written by Martin Gilens. And I feel like I've never read this book. I found out about this book after reading his study. But I feel like if you want to learn more about it, maybe that's the place to go if you're an American. But yeah, anyways, I am Sinner. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.